Hi, this is Joel Duff, and welcome to the first of a series of lectures on parasitic plants in which we explore the biodiversity, genetics, and origins of these fascinating organisms. In this first episode, we're simply going to ask the question, what is a parasitic plant? And what can we learn about parasitic plants? In effect, I'm going to try to get you interested in parasitic plants so that maybe you'll return and listen to future episodes. So when you hear the word parasite, we typically think of animals, but there are plants that are parasites too. What makes a plant a parasite? Well, the idea of parasite is that it's an organism that is procuring resources from another organism to benefit its survival, but not necessarily benefiting the person that's being, or individual that's being stolen from. And that's true, very true, for some plant parasites. And as we're going to see, though, there are some parasitic relationships that are border on more mutualistic relationships. We still call them parasitic plants because they are procuring some resources from other plants, or in some cases, not just plants, but other types of organisms on Earth. About 1% of all flowering plant species are identified as parasitic plants. So that might be a surprise in itself, that they're really very common. There's about 4,500 species of parasitic plants. And as I'm going to show you, there are several species here in North America. Actually, there's dozens and dozens of species in North America, but I'm going to show you several that are very common, and once you learn to identify them, I think you'll begin to see them all around you as you walk in the forest. Why do I have a particular interest in parasitic plants, or what are you going to learn from me in terms of parasitic plants? Well, from 1995 to 1999, I was involved in molecular genomic studies of parasitic plants as a postdoctoral research associate at Southern Illinois University. There I looked at plastid genomes of parasitic plants. I had an advisor who is a world expert on several different groups of parasitic plants, special mistletoes. And so I'm going to be showing you many of some of his work and some of his pictures as well as I go through this series. So I've had a special spot for parasitic plants, though in the last 15 years I have not had the opportunity to study them. And it's been really a fascinating journey to be able to go back now through the literature and find out what has been found, what has been discovered about parasitic plants since the time in which I was really thinking about them. So let's start off with a parasitic plant again. I'm going to introduce you to a kind of an odd one, right? Not an odd one. I'll say a more extreme version of parasitism. Now, I'm going to be showing you a lot of very bizarre parasitic plants, and I'm not going to show those all to you today, right? I got to keep something in reserve for other episodes. But I thought I particularly like this one, and I like this one because I've taken a lot of pictures of this one. This is a photo that I took of Monotropa uniflora here in Ohio, relatively common in some forests. And its common name is ghost flower. Okay. Ghost pipes, Indian pipes, obviously from its white coloration. So that's the first thing you're going to observe, right? Let's take a closer look at this. All right. So this plant, if I were to ask, what do you observe about this plant? You'll say, well, it's not green. Okay. I thought all plants were green, right? Isn't that a characteristic of plants? Plants are green. They have chlorophyll. They do photosynthesis. That's what plants do. They capture energy from the sun and they turn it into carbohydrates or molecular bond energy. This plant is white, therefore it doesn't have any pigment. Pigments are any molecule that's able to absorb electromagnetic radiation in the light spectrum. And via being able to absorb that energy, plants are able to convert that absorbed energy into chemical bonds, which eventually turn into sugars. If this plant's white, doesn't have those pigments, that means it's not absorbing energy from the sun. If it's not absorbing energy from the sun, there's no way it can capture energy from the sun. And therefore, this plant can't make its own carbohydrates, and therefore must procure its energy sources from elsewhere. So it's just like you and I, right? We can't procure our energy directly from the sun. It's sun's energy we're eating, but we're not converting sun's energy directly into carbohydrates. So we are heterotrophs, meaning we must obtain our energy from outside. Most plants, 99% of them, are autotrophs. They can take the sunlight's energy and convert it into carbohydrate. So this plant has to get their resource from somewhere else. Where do they get it from? This one is a mycoheterotroph. A mycoheterotroph parasitizes fungi in the soil. All right, somebody who studies fungi is a mycologist. The name for a bunch of hyphae of fungi growing in the ground is called a mycelium. All right, it's all the collective body of a fungus is the mycelia. And heterotroph, I just explained that term. That means obtaining energy from outside of oneself or having to consume energy. So this one consumes energy from fungi. Most of the parasitic plants we're going to talk about in this series obtain their energy from other plants, other vascular plants. So they're tapping into another vascular plant and procuring their resources that way. This one is actually attached, its roots underneath the ground are attached to fungal hyphae, and those fungal hyphae are normally around the roots of certain trees, and those trees have a mutualistic relationship with the fungi, right? The fungi are out there decaying, right, the organic material in the soil, and therefore getting nitrates and phosphorus and other kinds of minerals and nutrients along with water, and the plant can actually take in some of that from the fungus. All right, you could think of it as it's stealing it from the fungus, or you can think of it as the fungus is donating it to the plant. It depends on whether you want to view this as a nice relationship or both partners are sort of stealing from each other. What the fungi is getting from the plant, though, is the fungus can take and absorb some of the sugar or the carbohydrate from the tree, and so therefore get some energy from the tree as well. And so they have formed I'm going to call it a mutualistic relationship that helps both partners. In this case, Monotropa uniflora has taken it to a new level. Rather than sharing, they have decided to take all of their resource from the fungus, but they don't really have anything to give in return, right? They're not doing photosynthesis, so therefore they don't have an energy source that they can give back. And so it's a one-way street. This is truly a parasitic relationship. And yet it produces these beautiful plants. I think that they're beautiful. You'll often find these in fairly dark portions of the forest because, hey, they don't need the light. And so it kind of makes them hard to photograph. So I felt very fortunate there was sort of a light beam coming down and striking this particular set of monoflora. And so I was able to get this particular picture. Now, let me toss in one other thing here, too. I say here that where does this plant, what plant is this like? If you were to ask the question, we're going to ask this question for a lot of different parasitic plants. What is this parasitic plant most like in terms of its green relatives? And in this case, this particular plant, Monotropa, along with several dozen other species in this group, are placed in the family Ericaceae, which is called the heath family, or more commonly maybe known as the blueberry family. So let me show you what one of those plants looks like. This is a heath plant that is genetically one of the most similar ones to this Monotropa. And obviously there's a lot of contrast here. There's a lot of differences. The other thing I forgot to mention as an observation is that this particular plant really doesn't have any leaves, Monotropa. And that's a characteristic of most plants, right? They have leaves because they want to capture the sunlight. But if you think about a holoparasite that's stealing all of its resources from something else, there is no need to have a leaf. It would serve no purpose. And so I'll say they have gotten rid of their leaves. But we're going to leave that off to a future discussion of the origins or the ancestors of parasitic plants when we talk about where they come from. So let's back away now, and I said this is an introduction to parasitic plants, and let's just give a broad overview of the types of parasitic plants that there are. I'm showing you kind of a radical one. I said there's others that aren't nearly as dramatic. And so if we were to break down parasitic plants, we can break them down into two different types. We have something called the holoparasites, and holo means whole or complete. You can think they're completely parasitic. They're absolutely dependent on their host. And then we have the hemiparasites, and the hemiparasites are partial parasites. And the hemiparasites can be broken down into obligate hemiparasites. Obligate means that these species must have a host. They have to live on a host. but they are not completely parasitic in the sense that they are often, like this case, they still may have green leaves. They're still doing photosynthesis. And so they are contributing some to their own energy production, but they still have a host that, as we'll see in the next episode when we look at hemiparasites, gives many advantages to that particular plant. And then there's facultative ones, and they're the least dramatic of all the parasites because they're plants that can be free-living and do everything on their own, so they have the genome that allows them to do all of what any plant would need to do to live by itself. However, it does have the capacity to tap into resources from other plants if the opportunity avails itself. So if they're around the right host species, they could connect with it and they could obtain some resources from that host, but they don't necessarily need it to survive. The obligate one must be in a host at all times for its survival. And then the holoparasites obviously are completely dependent on hosts because they require everything from their hosts. And so one of the things we're going to look at is we're going to look at these organisms from their morphology, the way they appear. But then we're going to ask questions about, well, what's going on the inside? What are the genetics of these? How are they accommodating these different kind of styles? And what's happened to their genomes over time as they have adapted in these various ways? All right, so let's go back to the hemiparasite theme and just show you a couple of these. So hemiparasites, I wanted to say one other thing about this. These photos and this image was made by Dan Nickrent, who is my postdoc advisor from 95 to 99. And I was working in his lab at the time that we made this particular slide. And his specialty is working on the Santalaceae and the Viscaceae, and those would be things that commonly would be known as the mistletoes. There's well over 1,000 different species of mistletoes. It's not just one species. There are several common ones that are used as mistletoe or procured as mistletoe, but it's not all the same species. So what does a mistletoe do or a hemiparasite do? Well, in order to be a parasite on another vascular plant, they create a connection called a haustoria or haustorium. And this is what you're looking at right here. This sort of what looks like a cancerous growth on this tree. All right, on this tree, it's got this extra growth, and that is stimulated by this particular plant right here. This is the mistletoe. And you'll see this is a green plant, so it has the capacity to do photosynthesis, make its own carbohydrate, but it's not in soil. It doesn't have any roots, so it's not obtaining its water and minerals by itself. It's actually using this tree to obtain it through its roots. So as it passes information or that substance up the tree, it's able to extract some of that into that plant, and it does its own photosynthesis. And so we'll talk a little bit later about how this haustoria is formed, but you can think of it as the place where the tissues of these two different species, which can be drastically different types of plants, how these two different species connect and they form the integration of their tissues, allowing for the passing of sometimes just water and nutrients, but sometimes sugars can be passed back and forth as well. So when you look up in a tree and you see, and this is common more in the south than it is this far north, but I've taken pictures in southern Illinois of this, you might see, especially evident in the winter, these big green balls. And what those are is those are mistletoes that are a different species, all right, a plant, than the tree that it's on. Here's a more dramatic example. This picture from Dan Nickrent of Phorodendron, which is one of the most classic mistletoes in the Santalaceae family. So like I said, there's over 1,000 species there. And this is quite an infestation of mistletoe on this particular tree. So you can see in the wintertime, the leaves have fallen off, but all this green stuff is mistletoe that is still stays green throughout the winter. It's an evergreen. And one of the interesting things about mistletoe is the question of, is this a mutualistic relationship? Is this a one-way parasitism? Could the tree be getting something out of this relationship? We'll explore that question a little bit later. All right, back to the weird ones, the holoparasites. So this is rafflesia. This happens to be one of the holoparasitic plants that I worked on with doing DNA studies back in the late 90s. And this is my postdoc advisor right here, Dan Nickrent, staring into this rafflesia flower, which is the world's largest single flower. Now this particular one's not actually that big. They can be about 3 times that size, but that's a pretty hefty flower. And he's in Borneo where he's collecting that material. I never got to go to Borneo, but the material got sent back, and then I got to extract DNA from plants like this. And so we'll talk about these holoparasites, which are truly bizarre organisms. This is really all you would ever see of this plant. The rest of its life cycle is under the ground, or at least inside of a vine. So let's look at a little bit more mundane one, but a very common one that almost probably anyone here in North America has probably seen and not known they've seen. And hopefully after this, you'll now recognize it. You'll be like, hey, I see a parasitic plant. And you can tell people about parasitic plants. This is cuscuta. And there are many, many, many species of cuscuta. I took this picture just a few miles from my home here in Ohio at a local park. I was just walking along a boardwalk, and there are some reeds in this wetland, and I saw this little orange string, and I said, cuscuta, right? That's cuscuta right there, this vine, this orange vine. So this orange vine is climbing around here. And what is hard to see here is these little bumps here are the hostorial connections. So it's tapping into, it's sending little bits of tissue into that reed, and it is extracting energy and water and nutrients from the reed in order to continue its growth. And here's a little flower. All right, so this is a plant, it has no leaves. It's just a vine with flowers, and that's it. 2 years ago, we were driving through Death Valley, just down the road, and I was looking out the window, and I saw this, what looks like yellow silly string on top of this plant. And I said, hey, there's some cascuda out there. Stopped, took a picture. Right, so even out here in the desert, there's this parasitic plant that is parasitizing one of the few things that's managing to barely, eke out a living there. And now you have another plant on top of you extracting energy from you. So that just makes it that much tougher. So that shows that parasitic plants, sometimes they don't do a lot of damage, but other times they can be quite detrimental. So what about this cuscuta thing? Like, what is it most similar to? Right? It's hard to say it looks similar to any other plant that you would know. Taxonomists have said, used to put it in its own family, but now they've realized through genetic studies, and this is why we need to talk a little bit about genes and why looking in the genome really tells us a lot about these organisms. Once the genome was looked at, they realized they're really not that different from, in fact, they're nestled inside of the Convolvulaceae, which is the family that includes Convolvulus, which is morning glory, and Ipomea, another popular vine with a pretty flower. All right, so this plant is really a parasitic vine that belongs to this particular family, but obviously it's lost most of its ability to do photosynthesis, and it doesn't have any leaves anymore. So again, we need to talk about like that relationship, and then talk about whether they share a common ancestor, and how they might be related, and what evidence do we have that they are related. I need to give you that particular evidence. Here's another cascuda species. They're pretty wide-ranging in terms of their hosts. Some parasitic plants are very specific. They can only live on one particular host. We'll look at ones that live on beech trees, for example, only. Cascuda is kind of a generalist. It'll climb over a whole bunch of different plants and infect them. Right outside our church, there's a little flower garden, and one Sunday it came out there and looked down, and there was cascuda just all over the place. Within 2 weeks, it had just grown up all over, and it was attached to multiple different species of plants. They're found over 200 species of cascuda on all continents except Antarctica. They're orange like this one. Again, just looks kind of like silly string, but it's actually attached to these other plants. And they can be yellow, and sometimes they're greenish, and it turns out they do have a range of photosynthetic capacities. And so we will look at different species and see how different species have differing abilities to do photosynthesis based on what's left in their genome. All right, so that's a whirlwind tour of the basics of what a parasitic plant is, a tiny bit about the diversity of parasitic plants. And so in future episodes, we're going to continue to examine different strategies that parasites employ to survive. examine the fate of chloroplast genomes in non-photosynthetic plants, so like this white Monotropa here. It does have a chloroplast genome, and a chloroplast is the subcellular organelle, all right, factory, right, for doing photosynthesis. They still have chloroplast, and so the question is, well, what are they doing with their chloroplast if they're not doing photosynthesis? And so we'll look at chloroplast genomes and what they can tell us about the current parasites, but also maybe about their history. And we're also going to reveal the high levels of horizontal gene transfer that's occurring from host plant to parasitic plant. Some very interesting recent studies that show that dozens of genes have been moved or captured by parasitic plants from their hosts and moved from the host and placed into the parasitic plant genome, where they are actually using those genes. So what are they using those genes for, and how does that happen, that one organism can actually take genes from another organism and move them and utilize them in another place, possibly for a different purpose? And of course, we want to explore the origins of some parasitic plant species and families. So thank you for watching. I hope that piques your interest in parasitic plants, and you'll return to learn more about these fantastic organisms. Thank you very much for watching.